You're listening to a programme from BBC Radio 4.
Welcome to What Sources Say is What the Papers Say with me, Peter Hitchens. In the night and fog which surround the issues of terror, intelligence and what we like nowadays to call security, sources often replace actual people. By definition, readers don't know who these sources are. Once you start quoting sources, you move into a world of shadows. The sources cannot be identified or held responsible for what they are supposed to have said. What they're said to have said can't be checked either. Yet last week, hundreds of stories in British national newspapers about the Sharm el-Sheikh airline tragedy alone contained references to such sources.
Sources close to the crash investigation told Agence France-Presse.
According to several media reports citing unnamed sources,
a government source last night said...
A senior government source rejected claims.
And if journalists can be a bit heavily reliant on such things, how much more so are the security and intelligence services, ever hungry for more power to sift through our phone and email records? Put the two together, and what do you get? Listen to this from the Daily Express.
Britain is living under a serious threat of terror.
Is it? Are you quite sure?
The communication techniques being used by our enemies are constantly evolving. Helped by the rapid pace of technological change, they are finding it far too easy to hide their online activities from the police and security services.
Good heavens, how frightening. Lucky, then, that we're planning new laws to deal with this very thing, eh?
Our laws on surveillance are in desperate need of an upgrade to counter this new threat. Our security services have done a fine job of foiling terror attacks in recent years, but restrictions on their ability to monitor the internet only hamper their efforts. This is why this newspaper welcomes the measures announced by Theresa May yesterday.
The leading article then made the ritual obeisance to the
tricky balance to be struck between giving the authorities enough access to communications and protecting an individual's right to privacy.
But not to worry.
The safeguards put in place provide significant reassurance that Mrs May has got this balance right.
This talk of balance between irreplaceable liberty and indefinable, unmeasurable, unaccountable security always brings to my mind Benjamin Franklin's remark that
those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety.
And not everyone was quite so sure. The Guardian, while still making that ritual bow to
striking a sensible balance,
was less inclined to believe everything it was told. Calling Mrs May's package
Snooper's Charter Mark III,
it warned that boring-sounding metadata which the state wants to gather are so informative about you that they
may sometimes reveal that you're gay not only before you tell your mum, but before you know yourself.
Sources tell me that the government didn't much like that, but other sources were in full flow last week, watering the otherwise barren landscape of politics, where many must be tiring of shock revelations that the Labour Party has acquired a socialist leader, as the Daily Telegraph declared on Tuesday.
David Cameron has apparently shelved plans to push for British airstrikes against the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant in Syria after failing to secure support from Labour MPs. The Prime Minister had hoped to go to Parliament for a vote on extending military action by the end of the year. However, Whitehall sources claimed that David Cameron was unable to persuade enough of Jeremy Corbyn's MPs to defy their leader on the issue.
No named person actually said any of this, just a source. And lo, the Telegraph's main rival, The Times, appear to have found a remarkably similar source.
David Cameron has abandoned plans to push for British airstrikes against Islamic State in Syria after being foiled by the opposition of Labour MPs for the second time in 2 years, The Times has learnt.
It's very odd, in an age when we're all obsessed with how our meals are prepared or our cakes are baked, that we pay so little attention to the way news is cooked. Take Monday's papers. The Daily Telegraph.
May could campaign for Britain to leave EU.
The Independent.
Theresa May has left open the option of leading the drive for Britain to quit the European Union.
Theresa May. That Theresa May. She's just everywhere these days, but Mrs May has never exactly been a modern Boadicea. The idea of her leading a popular mass movement of secessionists, pitchforks waving, against the Brussels despots, boggled my mind. What did she actually say? I turned to the BBC's official transcript of the Andrew Marr interview with the Home Secretary. Andrew Marr asked,
Out there, they think you are the politician who can bring over Conservatives and people who vote UKIP and undecided people for Britain leaving. Is there any prospect of you doing that at all?
And Mrs. May replied,
The government was elected on a mandate to actually renegotiate within Europe, and that's what I'm doing. And you know, there are some people who say you should be in at all costs. There are people who say you should be out at all costs. Actually, I say, let's do this renegotiation. Let's see what reform we can bring about as a result of that renegotiation and then put it to the British people.
Repeated questioning on the same lines produced enough grey flannel to make a suit, capacious enough for an old-fashioned Tory constituency chairman, fond of lunch. In the end, Andrew Marr gave up, saying,
I have an instinct which tells me that I'm not going to get a headline tomorrow saying, Theresa May, I'm leading us out of Europe.
But his instincts, as it happened, were wrong. That is, more or less, what we did get. How do these things happen? Political reporting, with its unattributable briefings and ceaseless off-the-record lunches, often seems to serve the government more than it serves the media or the reader. A single good piece of sketch writing can tell us more than acres of this stuff. Michael Deacon, in the Daily Telegraph, last week scored 2 triumphs of witty brevity on big current issues, slicing to the core of the matter with a beautiful light touch.
Cameron takes dumbing down to a new low,
Was the headline on Deacon's description of a peculiar appearance by the First Lord of the Treasury on ITV's This Morning, which I wish I could quote in full.
Mr. Cameron was telling this morning's viewers why the government needed new powers to monitor internet activity. It was because the internet, explained the Prime Minister sternly, shouldn't be a place where criminals can plot to do bad things.
Yes, he really said that, Deacon mused.
I don't know what demographic the Prime Minister thinks This Morning is aimed at. Perhaps primary school children. At any rate, you probably wouldn't hear him using language quite as simplistic as that in the Commons.
Mr. Speaker, this government is determined to stop the bad men doing bad things. To that end, we are going to look in people's computers to see what the bad men are saying. If the bad men are being naughty, we will run and tell a policeman, and the policeman will take the bad men to prison. Nee-no, nee-no, nee-no.
The following day, Michael Deacon turned to the Chancellor of the Exchequer's visit to Berlin, where he failed to explain to the Germans what concessions the government wants the European Union to make.
Even if you don't like the people who run the European Union, you have to feel some sympathy for them. All they want David Cameron and George Osborne to do is to tell them, frankly and clearly, what it is that they want. And yet, to continental bemusement, all the two of them offer is the occasional hint or glimpse. The Europeans must feel as if they're being made to watch the world's longest and least promising striptease.
He imagined the exasperated Germans eventually cracking under the strain.
It is a testament to the good manners of his German audience that none of them shouted,
God in Himmel, just spit it out, man. We can't tell you whether we are willing to give you what you want until we know what you want.
This didn't happen, but Mr. Deacon provided what must be the most succinct analysis of any government policy made anywhere last week.
Maybe they've twigged that Messrs. Cameron and Osborne can't afford to be upfront about what they want. Because if they were upfront about it and then didn't get it, they'd look bad and have no choice but to campaign for Britain to leave the EU, which they don't want to do.
But they can't say that openly. So we're left with sources. The Independent on Sunday, reporting a speech that hasn't yet been made, announced,
In a speech on Tuesday, the Prime Minister will argue that EU regulations could
Hold back our ability to trade.
and that membership has led to an
Unsustainable rate of migration.
into the UK.
however,
He will also vow to campaign
With all my heart.
in favour of an in vote in the referendum that is due by 2017, should he succeed in getting agreement for his proposed reforms.
and then informed us that,
And Number 10 source said the
Temperature is increasing. Things are stepping up.
in negotiations with the EU over reform. The source said the UK was entering a period of
Intensive political contact with member states.
but Nigel Nelson in the Sunday People seemed to have got a rather different impression from his source.
David Cameron is to give the EU an ultimatum on Tuesday. Give us what we want or we're out. A Whitehall source said,
We are now putting our cards on the table. We are entering the phase of intensive engagement with member states.
Note the recurrence of the word intensive. As a bit of light relief amid all these sources, I would here like to insert a small piece of actual factual news from Tuesday's Independent, which may tell future researchers more about life in Britain in 2015 than square miles of political reporting.
a man who used a fishing line to smuggle such items as a McDonald's McMuffin, a Kinder Surprise egg containing 5 mobile SIM cards, a bottle of vodka and a number of USB chargers into Wormwood Scrubs prison, has been given a 2.5-year prison sentence. CCTV footage shows a man tying a rope to a bag, which was then pulled up into the prison and into one of the cells.
Presumably, he had time to wolf the McMuffin before the authorities arrived. But this sort of thing makes me nostalgic for the days when the courts, where the naked truth about life, the universe and everything is on daily display, were much more regularly reported than they are now. But that's very expensive, as is old-fashioned foreign reporting by experienced veterans. I still yearn for that and long for good analysis of the amazing developments in Turkey, a NATO member and keystone state in the Middle East, where Recep Tayyip Erdogan has been building what seems to me to be a rather frighteningly strong state, personality cult, huge presidential palace and all. You can say harsh things about Russia's similar Vladimir Putin and everyone will join in, but coverage of Turkey's slither down the slopes of despotism seems to be written with the handbrake on. Take this wonderful bit of understatement from Monday's International New York Times.
A government crackdown on dissent before the vote, with angry mobs attacking newspaper offices, and just days before the election, a police raid on a media conglomerate opposed to the government, raised concerns in the international community about Turkey's commitment to democracy.
Yes, well, it might just do that. As it happens, we have been warned. President Erdogan is famous for comparing democracy to a tram.
You ride it till you arrive at your destination, then you step off.
Imagine how many times you'd have heard that, and how prominently, if Vladimir Putin had said it. But Mr. Erdogan is a NATO head of state, so verdicts on his behaviour and coverage of his actions might just be softer and less prominent than they ought to be. Hence, The Guardian's report on Wednesday,
Dozens arrested across Turkey as Erdogan targets rivals and media.
appeared only on page 17.
The Turkish government has resumed its crackdown on the media and political rivals of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, 2 days after his emphatic win at the polls resulted in a return to single-party rule. Police officers and bureaucrats loyal to Fethullah Gulen, an exiled cleric based in the US, are among dozens of people who have been arrested as the authorities tried to suppress a group whose members have become bitter rivals of the president.
I had this idea that democratic elections involved the concept that the other side had the freedom to criticise and oppose the government. Obviously, I was mistaken.
Earlier, dawn raids targeted figures allied to the wide-ranging movement that pledges allegiance to Gulen, a preacher who is to stand trial in absentia for allegedly working to topple Erdogan.
Even The Economist, which for years reported Mr. Erdogan's actions sympathetically and called him mildly Islamist, finally snapped.
Another victory for illiberalism.
And its deeply pessimistic conclusion reminds us of what happens in countries where security trumps liberty.
For him, the lessons of an electoral campaign based on escalating war, talking up ethnic tension and repressing press freedoms are clear. It worked.
Good night.
You can download many more BBC Radio 4 programmes for free. Find these at bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.